Hello and welcome to CDI TV.
Welcome everyone.
Welcome everyone. We're beaming into you today. Unfortunately, Carolina has broken her ankle. We're sending our thoughts to Carolina. Michael is otherwise engaged, so I've taken this opportunity to hack into the CDI TV system, tactical media-like, and bring you this unsanctioned broadcast. My name is Craig Gent. You might have seen me on the Cyberboss stream or in the comments section below before, and I'm joined today by Cecilia Ghidotti.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is, I think, my first time on this side of the camera officially.
For sure. How are you finding it so far?
Slightly intimidating, but I'm sure it's going to be fine by the end of it.
I think we'll be fine. Today we're talking about refusal, quitting, resistance, resignation, all of the good things. And to celebrate, we have our Prosecco. Cheers. How do you say cheers in Italian?
Salute.
Salute. Cheers to our in-person audience and cheers to the
Thank
billion
you to the
beaming
in-person audience for staying here in this summer afternoon and just not to leave ourselves alone to talk to each other and to the people on the streaming which are there, I suppose.
Well, actually, that's a great place to start because this conversation that we're having here, I should explain. We're letting people in on a conversation that's actually been a long-running conversation between Cecilia and I. Which began, we were just discussing before off air, we think maybe with a previous episode of CDI. Yeah, so this was the episode with Gandini, if people remember, on I think digital disruption, and Cecilia asked a question about neo-Luddism and refusal and these sorts of frameworks, and I kind of went back then to look through Cecilia's work and found that she had done a research seminar in the CMPS here at Warwick sometime before on quitting in the creative industries, and this
correct.
then led to a conversation between us and a few Zoom calls about the ideas.
Yeah, and then we decided to expand this in this mixed digital and in-person forum just to, to set up another conversational event outside the setting of the Teams meeting that may feel a little bit impersonal sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think like this is an extension of the work we've been doing in CDI more broadly to try and use live streaming as a research format. So today we're not presenting something that we've some piece of work we've prepared to talk about, like a research seminar. This is very much an ongoing conversation between us that I'm sure will continue off camera as well. But today we want to let you in on it.
Yeah, we are kind of taking the liberty of having a dialogue, an open dialogue, without having a very strict and preset presentation, like something to deliver, perhaps because the topic we are engaging with is somehow sympathetic to this type of more loose presentation. But yeah, this is an attempt of making this space perhaps a little bit more spontaneous, a little bit less rigid. Let's see how it goes.
It's a kind of strategy of refusal in action. We'll get there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cecilia, the first thing I want to ask, and maybe we can ask each other, is we talked a bit before when we were discussing this idea that as well as having kind of an intellectual engagement with quitting, with refusal, with resignation, with resistance, we each kind of have like a sort of like, a personal history with these ideas, not necessarily because we're quitters or refusers, but we've gravitated towards these ideas somehow over a period of time, maybe because of some political sympathies or also some observations. So you want to go first? Let me hear about how you came to quitting.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when we start thinking and designing this, I kind of went back and thought how I have been, let's say, receptive to the topic of quitting. And I kind of had to recognize that it doesn't come from like a theoretical lineage, but from like a few, let's say, specific experiences which have to do with my biography. And I think that as academics sometimes don't have the opportunity to connect some moments of our biographies to our I don't know, intellectual interests. So I wanted to take the space of this forum today, but also, to kind of open up a little bit on that, even if there is like an element for me of like vulnerability to go on camera and telling you a bit of my, let's say, intellectual biography. But I hope it's not too boring or too meaningless. So basically, my connection with quitting traces back to an experience when I was a student at the University of Bologna around 2007, 2008. And that was the moment of one of the many university reform brought about by the Italian government in a very neoliberal sense. So like the change of the recruitment for researchers and so on. At the same time, we were, as students, we were still students into a module which was all about studying some writers, from some American writers, and among them it was the case of Melville and the history of Bartleby the Scrivener. So somehow the protest against this reform of the university merged with this ideal type of character. So the Scrivener in Melville's story is a character who is kind of committed to a continuous act of refusal. He keeps saying, I would prefer not to any type of task which is assigned to him. So, and this kind of leads to a downward spiral, which has not, let's say, a very positive outcome. However, as a part of the student movement, we kind of took that character, which then became the name of an occupied space. It became the name of a place of, let's say, resistance, because it was actually an occupied space in a university building. And on a level, we use the figures of Bartleby and his, let's say, resistance, is a space of negative resistance to build something of like oppositional and positive. We hosted concert, lectures, and this type of thing. So I think that my idea that quitting is not necessarily giving up, is not necessarily a space of negativity, is not a space of not being able to do anything, but actually a space of opposition that can lead to something, traces back to that in my university year in Bologna. Obviously, that space doesn't exist anymore because the university took it back because they wanted to do some sort of residence for the students. The space is actually still very much empty and very much in decay in terms of how much, taking up the example of someone who said no, ended up building something, and then in the end, those who were institutionally in charge of building something into the space, they didn't. So yeah, that was perhaps my interest or original interest story in quitting. And then there's all the lineage of being in Bologna and the connection with what was left of all the autonomist tradition, but we can talk about that later. What about you?
So for me, interestingly, I mean, a similar experience, maybe, a few years after you, I went to university. Well, I went to university in 2008. I dropped out. I worked for a couple of years. I lost my job. I decided to go back into higher education. So from 2010, I was working as a student in higher education. And at this point in time, there was a sort of growing awareness of what the cuts proposed by the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition were going to mean for civil society and for education. So like many students, I participated in quite kind of ordinary demonstrations and things that were happening around that time. But it was kind of an interesting political movement because, we started off with sort of demonstrations and then we moved into occupations also. And this was a real space where you're surrounded by fellow activists sort of 24/7 and you're exchanging ideas with them. And we were very much waiting for the labor movement to catch up with us. They did in 2011, in the March of that year, with a big sort of demonstration organized by the Trade Union Congress. And the framing of the march was big disappointment to a lot of students, because the march was all around sort of marching for jobs and this kind of thing. And at the time, we were beginning to kind of encounter ideas around sort of anti-work politics or the autonomous tradition in Italy, which many sort of Italians I speak to find it amusing that autonomous
the type
Marxism,
of reception, which yes,
that autonomous Marxism has had such a life in the imaginations of so many British leftists. But we had sort of begun to say, we're not marching for more work, we're marching for a liberation from work. We were trying to imagine a different kind of society, which would be the polar opposite of austerity cuts, but nor would it rely on a kind of social democratic settlement that clearly had, particularly by the time of the global financial crisis in 2008, had kind of crumbled and seemed never to return. And so around that time, I was sort of ended up meeting a lot of activists from previous generations of a kind of longer political struggle, who were sort of broadly sort of left-wing libertarians, and many of whom had been involved with activism in Italy in particular. This is going to be a recurring theme. And it was an archivist and militant called Seth Wheeler who's also sort of like documented many critical moments of political upheaval in this country, who introduced me to the ideas of autonomism, of autonomia. So autonomia was a political movement, really sort of beginning with operaismo or workerism in the sort of late 50s and 60s in Italy, and by the 70s had kind of become a street movement with a big student presence, and also, as was happening across all shades of the political spectrum in Italy at the time, also sort of a paramilitary sort of faction to it as well. And of all these different factions sort of like fighting for the soul of kind of Italian society in one way or another. So through becoming sort of exposed to these ideas, they shook up for me, as was the intention back in the 70s, a certain orthodoxy around what, for example, trade unions are for, or what left-wing parties are for, or what kind of world we want to exist. And these were very much sort of dissenting from an orthodox, like Marxist perspective. And instead of saying we want to valorize our sort of role as workers within a working class, they said what we want to do is to abolish. If we want to abolish class society, that also means abolishing ourselves as workers and disengaging from these categories instead of romanticizing them, which was obviously a very radical thing to do at the time. And I won't say that there were enormous numbers of people doing it in the 2010s, but there were a few people giving it a good shake. And shortly afterwards, I became involved with a project that was founded right out of that movement called Novara Media. Novara Media, people often ask where it gets its name from. When I speak to Italians, they say this is like calling a sort of cool left-wing media project Dagenham Media or something, because Novara is an industrial town in northern Italy, in the Piedmont region. But it was the location and setting of a film that was very, very influential for us, called Lulu the Tool in the US, or The Working Class Goes to Heaven, La classe operaia va in paradiso. How I do?
Very well.
Very well. Okay, so this is a film about a worker with a sort of strongly Stakhanovite ethos who goes about his work as if it's his whole entire being, and we see through the film how even his libido has been attuned to the rhythms of his work when he's sort of working on his lathe. And one day he loses a finger, and it completely upturns his worldview when he realizes that the management, that the union, that no one cares about the fact that he's lost his finger in this role where he's been giving his life. And outside every day there are these autonomous students who rather provocatively are often arguing with the trade unions, and they're saying to the workers, you go into this factory when it is dark and you come out when it's dark, the sun will not shine for you. And, is this the world we want to live in, basically? Now, of course, this is a very sort of like romantic notion, but within this is this idea of kind of refusal. And so I suppose we can maybe get into the ways that we've engaged with these ideas so far, but I suppose that was it for me.
Yeah. Also, I mean, we are taking our time to share our genealogy, but genealogies. But also, I want to acknowledge that there are people in this room. So, in case you want to intervene, you want to ask questions, you want to make your contribution, we don't necessarily need to wait until the end for that moment of silence where we ask for questions and there are no questions and someone then builds up the courage to say something. So please, if you want to add something, feel free to, and we'll share the mic with great pleasure. What I wanted to kind of respond to you with was like that you clearly traced a genealogy which has to do with the 70s, with the social movement of the 70s, and with a sort of setting up of the work which was very different from nowadays. And so the way in which I engaged with this topic of will not wanting to work more disengaging with since the idea of work or the ideology of work for me was a very kind of semi-marginal interest, because there was nothing really happening out there at a societal level. And then boom, it's 2020, we are in the aftermath of the first COVID wave, and then all of a sudden, at least from my perspective, quitting, work refusal, great resignation, it's up in the newspaper, it's up on the media, and it seems like that the relationship with work as it has been built during the 80s, the 90s, and the until, let's say, the 2019-20 has gone under a seismic shift and is not there anymore, and people are starting to say, oh, I don't want to do this anymore. And there are waves of resignation, especially in the US, but also in China, in Italy. And despite those people not having any better alternative opened, or not necessarily, and absolutely not evolving into a existing socio-political movement, they are quitting anyway. So I was like, oh, okay, there's something there yet. So those ideas around like strategic refusal and saying no to a certain type of embodiment of the ideology of work, there's something there that is now resonating again. So on a level, I kind of went back to this constellation of interest of mine, and then I focused on the creative workers giving up to their ideas of becoming like aspiring creative workers giving up to the idea of becoming workers, but like that's a different strand. So I was kind of taken by surprise around 2020 about this wave of quitting. And was this the same for you? Were you more prepared? And what do you think about like present circumstances?
Well, I think that's very interesting. I suppose that one of the things that happened with the pandemic was that it clearly made a lot of people realize that, you know, life is certainly short and limited, and obviously sadly a lot of people were directly affected by the, you know, enormous death count of the pandemic. But it also sort of made people focus on either their work because they were an essential worker and they had to go out to work, or their work because they were forced to work from home and suddenly they had to sort of reorganize their home space around work and be kind of hyper aware of whether they're kind of, you know, connected or able to disconnect or not. Or of course people were in this country on furlough, and I'm sure that there were similar, you know, parallels in other countries as well, that gave people actually access to what is outside of work, which I think particularly for, you know, many people who have maybe over-identified with their work was quite kind of liberatory. But I suppose this maybe gets into an area that I know is like important in your work, where people sort of begin to maybe I'm going to use the word resist again for want of a better one, but the categories of certain sort of types of workers, particularly in certain types of industries, because I think what we saw with the Great Resignation was a few different things. Some people are choosing to essentially, you know, maybe quit one job in order to bargain for better market position within actually what is a very similar job, but also people, you know, choosing to adopt a different career direction entirely, and to sort of jettison, the connections that they had made, or the identity in life that they had made for themselves with a particular type of work, in favor of something that was more favorable to them. But I wonder how this kind of maps onto, you've obviously worked with, you've looked at workers in the creative industries who have kind of almost sort of rejected a certain kind of idealized model or character of, for example, the writer, and I wonder what they have kind of what that has meant to them too.
Yeah, I mean, the type of I didn't look directly at workers. It was always on aspiring workers. There is a level of disconnection between, let's say, people who are actually employed and paid for doing a job, and those who are still in the process of trying to make it. So perhaps it's different from what you've seen in your research, where you were looking more at active action of sabotage. So it's like perhaps this idea of not still being a worker opens up a different pathways for them. But in general, what I've noticed that in the scholarship on media and creative industries, there is a lot of research on the subjectivities of cultural workers, their working condition, this ideal type of intellectual worker who has to comply to a series of let's say unwritten rules, which have to do with being flexible, being ready to kind of accept any type of condition in the name of a desired identity as a creative worker. I mean, since the early 2000s onwards, research has kind of shown how tech workers are flexible, how TV workers kind of accept a certain type of condition in the name of their creative identities. What I found interesting was that I've encountered some people who said, okay, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this anymore. Even where they were still in the making, where they were still trying to do something there, they stepped out of this game, and for various reasons, because they didn't want to adhere to that ideal type of creative worker caught in the matrix of running across projects, and somehow the refusal was related to, I have a different attachment to my idea of culture. So these people, I want to take pleasure in reading books, I want to take pleasure in writing. I don't find that the type of jobs that are available to me are giving me that. It's a very privileged position, and in the end, they didn't end up succeeding in a traditional sense, because some of them, they could do this because they were from a upper middle class, so they had other means. Others, they just gave up to their, let's say, more creative identities, and according to some studies, just the idea of enrolling in a creative degree is a proof of the intention of developing a creative identity. However, I still find deserving of attention these type of acts, because they are not immediately productive. They are not ingrained into any political or union type form of activism, but I think that by the very fact of existing, they remind us that there are spaces of resistance, even if in the end, as Bartleby ends up in the graveyard, metaphorically, part of these end up being a little bit destructive. But still, there is a book called The Queer Art of Failure that says that there is there is a value in unbecoming, in making mistakes, in poking holes in the toxic positivity of everyday life, and this is where I resonate with. So I'm not saying that we should all go out and just quit everything, because I know that's not likely, but paying attention to this phenomenon as well as other phenomena, I think it's something that should find space in the, let's say, intellectual discussion in academia, just to open up and remind ourselves that there is a way out, even if we are all deeply ingrained in like capitalism structures. We are all witnessing as like passive testimonies what's happening in Gaza. I mean, I'm just opening up a little bit because this I think has to do with like cultivating spaces of resistance and recognizing where resistance is happening. I don't know if this makes sense at all for you or for anyone in the room or for anyone in the streaming. Also, we are not monitoring the chat of the streaming. Keith, is anyone in the chat asking things, saying things? Please let us know in case.
Yeah, begin putting your questions in the chat, and then we can also get to them as well. I mean, what you're saying at the beginning there is interesting because it really resonates, and also bring it back to Bartleby the Scrivener, brings it back to. Makes me think of my sort of experience coming to these ideas for the first time, particularly as a student activist, when a very popular refrain or idea at the time was the idea of the graduate without a future, and the idea that essentially the kind of promise of graduate jobs that had been promised to a whole sort of generation of students was evaporating before our eyes. And it's of course not that there were no jobs as such, but that they were very sort of precarious jobs. And our sort of totemic figure for many of us was actually from Italy again, which was the figure of San Precario.
Oh, okay.
The patrons. This is an invented patron saint of precarious workers.
Yeah, I think that comes from the Euromai Day parade in the early 2000s,
Yes.
when fashion workers in Milan, I think they came up originally with this San Precario figure, and it was also given out during the demonstrations.
It was, yeah. I have one of the original
Yeah.
badges. And we were also sort of taking this on our demonstrations into the street of London. There was the Precarious Workers Brigade, who would carry through the streets an enormous papier-mâché carrot to symbolize the carrot that was constantly being dangled in front of artists and other aspiring creatives. But I also think the latter part of what you're talking about there makes me think of maybe I can sort of explain a little of what Tronti was sort of speaking about with this idea of refusal. So Mario Tronti in the 60s becomes this kind of very influential figure within operaismo and within autonomism, and is most influential in this country for essentially two essays, because for years and years, until Workers and Capital was translated just a couple of years ago, they were the only pieces of his writing that were actually translated into English. So they were Lenin in England and the Strategy of Refusal. And in the Strategy of Refusal, in both these essays, what he's talking about essentially is he's inverting what was the Marxist orthodoxy theorizing the development of capitalism, which basically said that capitalists to sort of decide how they want to innovate, and then it's up to trade unions or labor parties or whatever, or workers' parties to sort of catch up and try to mediate the worst excesses of this sort of system, and this is how capitalism sort of develops. He inverts this. It's called the Trontian inversion, or occasionally the sort of Copernican inversion within sort of Tronti's thought, which is to say that it's the working class itself and working class struggle and refusal that creates crisis, a crisis of accumulation within capital, that then capitalists are forced to innovate and to develop and so on. Now, clearly this just creates a cycle of sort of never-ending capitalist development, and the idea behind the Strategy of Refusal is to try and find a way to create forms of life outside of capitalist work, and to sort of somehow break this. But he says that it begins with workers expressing, even at the individual level, their active dissatisfaction, is the phrase that he uses, through which maybe, and this is the real leap of faith, of course, through which maybe they can begin to collectivize this dissatisfaction and refuse en masse, which in his essay demonstrates, visibilizes the dependency of labor on which all of capital relies. But more than that, this idea was taking up, particularly in the 70s, to mean not only sort of refusing necessarily capitalism, capitalist work itself, but also the temporalities, the rhythms, the colonization of the mind that happens when subjected to forms of capitalist work. And in this sort of lineage of thinking, to say I would prefer not to becomes something that's a radically political act rather than merely a selfish one.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I was when you said that Tronti writings has been translated only recently, you seem to imply that, for instance, there is like a lineage of like Italian reception, which is more efficient at, which was more efficient at keeping those ideas alive, which I probably would say that's not the case, as which one? What? Okay. As the microphone. Also, the microphones are quitting. Something. Even technology is not with us anymore. No, that what I just wanted to add is that let's say heritage, that lineage of ideas was not really something that was kept alive in Italy, because all these efforts of the late 70s were obviously very disruptive for the society, and somehow they ended up being absorbed into the two kind of not even competing two forces of the heroin by one side, and also the armed formation and terrorism. So a lot of these ideas were somehow dismantled by these two forces, and what was potentially, let's say, revolutionary or disruptive of this idea that the working class is like somehow taking the lead in the opposition against capitalism was very much something that by the end of the 70s, the early 80s was not there anymore. So the late reception of these line of thoughts in the, let's say, British sphere is even more curious from the one Italian perspective, because the general narrative in Italy is that those social movements, they ended up being into destroyed into the drugs, heroin, or being set basically put in jail because a perceived association with the red terrorism, pretty much. So yeah, that's
well, maybe I can say something on that, which is, so it is important to say, I mean, the grave irony of all of this is that Tronti went on to become a sort of a leading and not particularly left-wing sort of social democrat, and when it was his turn in government, was actually advocating for austerity and all sorts of things. So it's a sort of bitter irony. But I mean, I think I can say something about that. How those ideas sort of entered into the British context, which is that there was, since the 70s, a kind of a movement of initially. They were kind of, if you can imagine such a thing, dissident Trotskyists, particularly around the groups like Big Flame, who had been organizing within workplaces and began to have a sort of serious engagement with feminist praxis that led them to critique the more kind of productivist and masculinist sort of forms of organizing that were happening around sort of British Trotskyism at the time. And led them to thinking seriously about the realm of social reproduction, and they then begin to engage with sort of ideas of the social worker or the socialized worker within the thought of people like Antonio Negri. And then really this kind of begins to die out at the moment until the 90s when it's sort of reignited by a growing sort of movement around the anti-Rhodes movement in Britain, and then the ultra-globalization movement, and it's kind of like British contingent here. Then, of course, we get Antonio Negri and Michael Hart's book Empire, which becomes a very, very unlikely bestseller in the year 2000. And then it sort of seems to snowball from there. But I think it's important to say that although many of the kind of activists involved in Italy at the time did, because of political repression, end up in very bad situations, in prison or on drugs, many of them also ended up in the academy. And this is maybe a good point at which to segue into our sort of final section before we open up, which is to say that what was happening in Britain in the 90s at the time when these ideas were being retaken up was that many people who saw themselves as refusing a kind of capitalist mode of work were signing on to the dole. And they were signing on to the dole because it was just about livable, and they could pursue, both political activism and artistic creation through doing so. Clearly, as we go into the 21st century, the conditions on living on unemployment benefit and are no longer able to support that. And many of them, at this point in time, are pleased to find out that the higher education sector is rapidly expanding. And so many of them become PhD students and academics, and they join higher education as a means to pursue their kind of intellectual pursuits in a relatively sort of shielded environment. I should say that Novara Media began and was viable in its in the very first case, not because of any sort of seed funding, but because a number of the core members, myself included, had PhD funding that allowed us to essentially work on a sort of alternative media project more or less full time until our final years. So obviously the circumstances of academia now seem somewhat different to how they did for many of my sort of like older comrades and colleagues who were sort of joining academia in the 90s and 2000s. But maybe this is a good point at which to sort of turn the lens back onto ourselves.
Yeah, no, we were thinking about where if academia still offers space where to cultivate dissent and space for thinking about quitting, because a line of analysis around quitting also comes via the analysis of academics, especially in the US, which at some point decided to quit and produce a variety of autobiographical essays around it was year 2000, 2015, about not being able to put up anymore with the neoliberal condition of contemporary academia, the need of writing grants, the publish and perish system, all the bureaucracy involved into academia. So at some points where we were having this conversation about quitting, I was saying, and what about us? What about us as people who are involved in process of critical thinking, who are not particularly happy about how academia is at the moment? Are there any space for this type of action, of subterfuge, quiet refusal? What type of shape this action could take? Should we, I don't know, sabotage some type of institutional demands? Is there a way out there? And so we kind of thought that this could be a question that was happening for us, but also for someone in the streaming or for someone in the room.
I'm imagining a sort of a global cabal of pissed off academics going to find MS Teams servers and giving it a good jiggle inside and saying, "Stop robbing me of hours of my life."
Yeah, you know what happened with the Waymo car in some cars in San Francisco or in Seattle? No, was it in San Francisco or in Seattle, somewhere in the US? LA, sorry. People went out and physically destroyed those self-driving cars called Waymo car. So yeah, something on the likes.
But in fact, they were calling the Waymo cars to their location en masse. So then you would have 10 Waymo cars turn up to one place.
And then they proceeded to sabotage them, and let's put sabotage into like brackets. But unfortunately, we cannot call the teams up physically here to do something and to act on that up, despite it would be probably a great act of small sabotage. But yeah, basically this was what we ended up thinking on. Okay, we started about, and also I mean this the initial idea of neo-Luddism has to be this. interrogation about quitting, does it need to be productive or it is enough just to open the conversation in the room? So should we do something more on top of this, or just naming the names? A certain someone said that naming was a creation act, so it was enough. So yeah, there was also a matter of like, okay, what's the because I think that stemmed from another seminar that you led. What's the point in sabotaging, in refusing? What's the point if it doesn't evolve in something else? It is enough just to open the conversation, or should we do something else as individuals, as academics? And so yeah, this is where are we coming from and where we are opening our questions, probably. Yes,
precisely. Well, with that, we should go to any questions we may have in the room or online, Keith.
Comments also.
No questions online just at the moment, so
Fine.
I'll hand the microphone out into the audience.
All right. Any questions from the audience? I mean, I think this is an interesting question while the mic is going around, Cecilia, because I think that in the 60s and 70s, it was enough to advocate for trying to find the exit, I think. And then certain forms of sort of, propositional forms of ways of living outside of the system were, maybe attractive to a minority of people. But primarily it was about trying to use quitting or refusal to demonstrate something about the way that work is organized in society. Now, clearly, a certain amount of work will always be needed for society to keep going. That's never in question. But the way it's organized within capitalism is in question. And for those thinkers, this was a way that they could achieve that. But I myself never quite know, and particularly at the moment when we're living in a sort of renaissance of neo-Luddism, as unlikely as that might seem to some people initially, I wonder whether the sort of tendency to want to propose something, well, what is the alternative, is coming from a place of political sort of desire and efficacy, and that's like the right instinct to have, or whether that is kind of simply almost imposed onto the conversation as a condition for having the opinion dissenting from the thing in the first place.
I wish I had an answer for this, but I don't think
too.
there is one.
Me too. But David may have an answer.
Go ahead. I most certainly don't have an answer to that. This was a really fascinating discussion, and thank you for kind of laying out actually some quite complicated sort of theoretical ideas in a really sort of accessible way. I felt that was really, really helpful. I'm conscious I might be about to out myself on the internet as a dangerous moderate, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I'm just wondering about actually pushing you on these things that you were talking about towards the end about what do you do after you quit? What do you quit? What are you quitting from and to? And what the kind of is quitting in this instance really just an evaluation between different types of work for different kinds of purpose in a context in which we kind of need to work to survive, right? I mean, there's a basic kind of flaw attached to that. But I'm also kind of conscious of, I think these ideas are really attractive and really good to think with, but I'm also conscious that not everyone feels that way about their work. It is entirely possible, as much as we might be sniffy about it, or as much as it might be possible for Marxist theorists to be disappointed by it, it's entirely possible for people to like their work, and indeed to use work as a source of dignity in the world. And I'm just wondering kind of what we do with that, that kind of sense that work itself might be a source for the distribution of a certain kind of justice.
Thank you, David. Cecilia?
Thank you, David. Yeah, for the first bit of the question about what I think it's super interesting. I wanted to start by answering the first bit, but now I want to start from the end. So what we do with that, what we do with people who enjoy their work and they find a moment of like self-fulfillment or partial self-fulfillment, think it's great. I don't think that any of these strand of reflections is saying let's just focus on that. It's a matter of like having different discourses opened at the same time. So I'm not when I say that, for instance, on the creative industries, the focus is on those who are doing the work on. You've done a lot of work on that. So I mean, it's not. I don't think the two things exclude each other. They can coexist at the same time. And thinking about time, you said what we do with quitting now. I think quitting. The first bit, I'm not kind of summing up your question and giving it justice. But what I'm trying to point out is temporality. So when we discuss about quitting, the way in which I think about that is not a definite condition, is not a final condition. To me, talking about quitting, refusal, resignation, this type of constellation, I would say, has to do with a flexible temporalities. So we increasingly live in a kind of we increasingly live a type of lives which are not longer ordered in that fashion: study, work, permanent job, marriage, etc. So in the name of this, my approach to quitting has to do with that porosity of contemporary condition, with the reversibility of that. So it's not that quitting is once for all. It can be back and forth. So if you think about like temporal lines, it can be a portion of time of someone's biography, and then it can be something else. A notable example is Simone Biles, the Olympic athlete. I make like an example which is an excellence, but she's notably an example of someone who very visibly quit, citing as mental health, whatever, but then she came back. So the way in which I approach quitting is very, very much flexible and very, very much related to the, let's say, precariousness of contemporary working life arrangements. So yeah, that's and I also recognize that there is like a class dimension in quitting, which we didn't engage with. There is like an intersectional dimension of quitting. Also, you can quit from work, but what about non-paid work in the like everyday life of like there is all the lineage of feminists thought about quitting domestic work. There's also that. What about people not living in the north of the world? What about people living in the, I'm saying this very badly, in the global south? They don't have the same type of ingrainment with the job, and they don't have the same approach to quitting. However, there are studies about, for instance, like migrant workers quitting despite their precarious life condition. So there's a lot to do to unpack this notion, to opening up to different temporalities, different geographies, different subjectivity. We are very much at the beginning of quitting here. Please. Go on.
I mean, you remind me that I had a sort of flashback to my childhood then, which is, I feel like for my whole childhood, my mum, who was a single parent, organized her entire life really around the refusal of work, and is doing as little work as possible so that she could focus on sort of socially useful things such as volunteering and raising children. I mean, I suppose there's a historical answer to what many of these activists, particularly in the 70s, did, which is that for many of them, I think they did try to explore alternative forms of living on the conviction that capitalism itself, this way of living, depends on people doing stuff. Right now we have to do it for a wage, but that, we can imagine a world in which we can still do the stuff, but it doesn't work within capitalist social relations. Or, I'd like to, obviously, Fisher quoting Zizek, quoting Jameson, etc., say it's easier now to imagine the end of the world than of capitalism, but which is not a conviction that they think needs to stop there. People always get them wrong on this, but the world and the social relations we have now already depend on our kind of labor, but the organization of labor under capitalism is not within our control. And so I think that it's a really pertinent point Cecilia makes to say that maybe this is not about a strategy of exiting capitalism as such, but actually one about sort of a certain form of kind of leverage, not with any particular employer, but in terms of regaining a sense of control over one's own life and the ability to exit conditions that are not favourable to us. The question, of course, is, well, when that happens, what is the support in place to do that? And I think that is where, for a lot of autonomists, they would say, well, this is why we organise politically in addition to whatever we're doing. This is why during the COVID pandemic, we do run mutual aid groups and things like that. So that we actually organise at a social level. And this is many intellectual traditions, right? Black Panther Party, people like to quote with, breakfast scheme for kids and so on, which was self-organised rather than kind of, it wasn't, some sort of benefactor kind of giving them money to do that. The other thing I suppose I would say, maybe in response to the question about, or the point about not everyone feeling this way about their work and maybe feeling a sense of sort of dignity in it. Again, I mean, with Cecilia, I don't see a problem with this, but I suppose in the spirit of making visible the social relations of work and of capitalism, maybe part of the idea that's underpinning these is about making visible the fact that work won't love you back. And that is a title of a great book by my friend and in a different part of life, my co-host on a podcast I run, Sarah Jaffe, who in her book, she's a labour journalist, and she spoke to many different types of workers, creative workers and non-creatives, but all in forms of work that almost typify the idea that, if you can do something you love, then you won't work a day in your life. And of course, the reality of that is really complicated, including for people working in the academy as well. But it is the truth, and I do believe this, that work won't love you back. And we can probably all think of people in our lives who have absolutely committed themselves to work, only to find at some crucial moment, a redundancy or something else, that actually they are dispensable. They're fundamentally dispensable, which is a very sort of crushing experience and so on. So I suppose maybe there's a point in here about making that social relation visible, so that we can kind of have a certain, I wouldn't say necessarily a class consciousness, but a certain consciousness towards the social relations of work.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to this, except how much of this is related to the work of Sarah Jaffe on Work Won't Love You Back. Also, there is another book which was really influential for me, which is Francesca Coin, The Great Resignation, which was out in Italy a couple of years ago, and I think it's going to be published in October in the English translation. So yeah, there is like a set of books that are working on this topic. And
Great, I haven't read that one.
yeah, probably I think we can try to host her for one of our meetings next year. Jonathan?
Yeah. Fascinating discussion, which is kind of bringing back some memories. So I've got a kind of half-baked comment / question. And it goes back to an essay I read years ago as a student, probably, by Adorno, called Resignation. He wrote it in the late 20s because at the height of the student movement in Germany, he was becoming pilloried as the kind of representative of the Frankfurt School, who students thought were becoming bourgeois in their old age, old scholars sitting in offices when they should be on the streets at the barricades, actually changing things. Adorno became a kind of a target, but he was kind of locked into his sort of Hegelian theory of history, where he did believe that there was a time when collective action could have brought about the collapse of capitalism back in the 20s, but that time had passed, and that he accused the student movements of collective action, of exhibiting all the social behaviors of the kind of Nazi and fascist groups that he had witnessed 15 years before. And so there was this huge row, this huge kind of public kind of debate over kind of what are the conditions for freedom. And this is the interesting question about quitting. it's a kind of emancipatory call, isn't it? It's about, it's another kind of call for freedom. And he would say that the material conditions for freedom no longer exist, which is why you attempt any collective action, you will simply mimic forms of power and domination that are endemic to any kind of mass politics. Populism is as common on the right as it is on the left. So his kind of response in the essay Resignation was to say, look, all we have left is the kind of the center of modern subjectivity, which is the kind of critical reflexivity of the intellect. So the kind of lone intellectual becomes the kind of last sort of gasp of collective politics. But he does kind of work it out with this essay, which is all about kind of the relation between theory and praxis, and what's the role of the intellectual? Is there a role for professors and academics and intellectuals in, not on the streets, but in the universities, sitting in their offices writing, and he would say that, because the material conditions for collective action no longer exist, they will only re-emerge as kind of intellectual forms. So the materiality of intellectual production can provide those conditions, but not yet. It's going to take a lot more work on behalf of intellectuals and thinkers and artists to kind of construct those. Now, that kind of train of thought, to me, is kind of inflected by a lot of cries for quitting on behalf of kind of American YouTubers in the so-called productivity genre of quiet quitting, and a kind of how would you put it? My favorite phenomena in this is the slow professor movement. I don't know if you go, and that is, let's go slow, everyone, which was an old kind of factory union technique. But there's a lot of versions of so-called quiet quitting and slow production, and I'm wondering whether you think those are just kind of, as Adorno would think, they're kinds of therapeutic imaginaries of, effectively pretending we can make capitalism humane, and yet it can't be. And the flip side to Adorno's critical autonomy of the intellect is all the people who don't engage in intellectual production, which is probably 98% of people, all they have left is just trying to make their lives more comfortable and endure everyday work by making their life humane, using the resources they have by going slower, by kind of, as you mentioned, temporalities, subverting the temporalities of capitalism, or kind of subverting the aesthetics of capitalism, because that's all we can do. Sorry, jumble of thoughts.
No, thank you for this. I don't know if I have anything very meaningful to kind of contribute to, because I think this is part of the conversation was to build a space where we can have a dialogue about this. I think that there is the quiet quitting bit. This is something obviously that I've looked at, but also what I've noticed is that people who are into kind of quitting somehow, they tend to love very much their work or not loving it. The quiet quitter side seems to call for a sort of detachment with work, which is perhaps not really possible for those who are quitting for a position of, let's say, love for their work, because they don't feel represented in it anymore, because it requires a lot of constraint, just doing the barely necessary. There was a song from the 70s in Italy called Lavorare con lentezza, working really slowly, and went on saying, without making any effort, who works faster injures themselves, they end up in the hospital. So, but to do that, you really don't have to have that attachment to work, on to ideal of work that somehow, for me, is behind the decision of like breaking up directly with work. It's not complete, it's not an answer to your comment, but this is what kind of made me think. So yeah, Craig?
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that we're all about the half-baked. We are indeed baking. This is the baking. This is like in CDI TV. We don't want to present the final idea. We're always already in the process of baking. So
let's hope we are in the oven and we are not the snails in the pot that don't notice how the water is getting warmer and warmer, because that would be a problem.
let's
Sorry.
hope not. Yeah. I mean, my actual first thing is that I think Adorno should have joined his students in the street, and that didn't preclude him ever being in the office either. Like, you can do both. Other theorists we can think of have done both. Foucault did both. Franco Peperno did both. I think that the point about whether or not, Tronti would say that and this, I say Tronti would say, not because I think he's the authority, but because this is, an essential idea that underpins a whole kind of intellectual tradition. But like that tradition would say that capitalist development sort of never, it never kind of gives us freedom. It's not about, a point in time at which we sort of like missed the opportunity for freedom or not. There's definitely an assertion of agency over the sort of, this kind of idea of like a Hegelian structure to historical development. But more than that, and we haven't really said the word very much, but an identification of autonomy, fundamental autonomy. And this means sort of two different things within autonomy. The first is a recognition of the working class's ability, and by working class, these guys mean all of us, people who have to work for a living, and who aren't able to make money because they own property or because they employ workers. They mean autonomy kind of in two senses. One is that they believe the working class can act directly without representation from trade unions or from workers' parties or labour parties, and doesn't need to wait for them. They have a complicated relationship to those things. They're not completely independent. People like Tronti, etc., were in their respective kind of, socialist or at that time communist parties. The Communist Party of Italy, which was anti-Stalinist but had 1 million members. It was the largest communist party in Western Europe, and a real sort of social force. So they would have it the other way around, that the working class is able to act already. But more than that, they also think that in terms of the labour relation, that workers' autonomy, inherent autonomy, is fundamental to the possibility of freedom, because labour does retain a fundamental autonomy that is also, I should say, recognised by labour process theorists. They refer to this, and so does Raniero Panzieri, who the autonomists, for example, refer to the unplannable element of capitalist organisation. So when, putting together, the enterprise, let's say, certain means of production need to be acquired, certain commodities, etc. And one commodity is labour power. Labour power is a commodity unlike other commodities in that it's a potential and needs to be actualised in the process of work, and therefore it's a fundamentally unplannable element, and that's why we have bureaucracies and within work and so on, as a means to try to sort of tame and ensure what the labour process theorists call certainty of result. And I think on the role of the intellectual, I mean, I think there's always a role for the intellectual, but I don't believe the only intellectuals in society are those who are professors. I mean, I don't know if this is a popular opinion or an unpopular one, but I think that, professor, etc. I mean, these are fundamentally job titles that describe a certain amount of primarily sort of, administrative responsibility within universities, and don't necessarily speak to the sort of weight of intellect behind the person. We know that from people who have been running Dundee University, for example, who were all professors. So shout out to everyone who's been fighting for their jobs at Dundee University. But many of these thinkers themselves were intellectuals too. They were worker intellectuals conducting co-research and workers' inquiries in not just kind of heavily industrial factories, but also kind of, sort of downstream sort of manufacturing plants. They were working in creative industries and so on. There were artists and dropouts and all sorts. And so I think there's a role for intellectualism, and I certainly sort of decry kind of the anti-intellectualism of, I mean, as they were decrying the anti-intellectualism of the orthodox Marxist parties who would say, you don't really need to kind of be able to sort of think for yourselves about the kind of life you want because the Central Committee is going to sort that out for you. They were dissenting from the left. They were dissenting from precisely that kind of mentality that was like an anti-intellectual tradition in favor of a much more liberatory decolonization, of the mind from the kind of constraints of capitalism. I think we have time for one more question, maybe, because we're running up against time. Joao, please.
Apologies if I'm slower and more incoherent than usual because of a bad episode of insomnia last night. But I wanted to be honest, what always fascinated me in Marx wasn't his materialist writing, which Engels, I think, in the third preface to either Communist Manifesto or the German ideology, says that
we're being tested now.
It was an overdetermination by Marx to be so materialist because it was a reaction against the idealism which was prevalent at the time. What really attracted me was always, the thing at his 18th of Brumaire, like the ideologies of generations past haunt that kind of writing really riveted me. So my question is perhaps a little bit provocative, and I think it puts us a little bit of in a tangent, because my question isn't really about changes in the job market, or really about, post-Fordism and how that affects a sort of capitalist dynamic, etc. Because I think that many times what is lost in left-wing discourse is, I'm sorry, this is such a cliche. I'm a man and I'm 19 years old, and I'm talking here about Nietzsche, but what Nietzsche called a spiritual crisis, right? Which is a very important dynamic in not only Western society, but throughout the globe. You see all that, there's a technological dynamic which is affecting all of us, which is progressing no matter what the Luddites do. There's, of course, capitalism, so like a more economic dimension, and then there's a social, cultural dimension as well. And in the beginning, you mentioned resistance, and there were some references to that. And you, Cecilia, and you, Craig, you probably mentioned resistance in a more left-wing way. But I am actually perhaps more familiar with resistance which is more perhaps conservative or even reactionary. I mean, every Sunday I speak with people in my parish which have a tremendous desire of resistance, and you can call it something else, but resistance against the modern world. And against this spiritual crisis or this social cultural dynamic, whatever you want to call it. And I think that this phenomenon of great resignation, et cetera, everything that you mentioned, I mean, abstracting it from all the categories, David was saying like, I'm quitting this job to maybe find another job or another type of job. I mean, it's a bit deeper than that, and I'm sorry that I'm really taking this into a very idealist dimension, etc. But I think it's important to share this more, epistemic outlook sometimes, which is important, and I think it's missed out a lot, as I said, in left-wing discourse. It's something that really sometimes annoys me. So I want to have your both of your opinions on that. To what extent is this phenomenon of great resignation and these changes in the capitalist structure affecting the spiritual lives of people? So how does that affect people raising families, etc.? For example, how does post-Fordism, or whatever you want to call it, affect creation of families, our lives? How do we lead our youth? That's been changing a lot in the last decades. Whatever you can think of, but more in that dimension, and not just sometimes in a very materialist way that it's really not attracts. It's not what attracts me in Marxism.
Wow. I am always fascinated by the level of depth that you manage to add at the conversations, because you've been, you are 19 years idealistic something, but we've seen you over these seminars contributing with this kind of depth, which is, I think it's a gift, having the possibility of talking at this level. I'm not sure.
Not on camera.
Not on camera. Okay. We'll delete that. No, right, Keith? But I don't know if I'm able to give an answer to at this kind of level of complexity, but I think that what it came to my mind while you were talking was that the processes that we were describing about the more recent, great resignation or doubts related to the way in which lives are organized into post-capitalist society, they mostly are not framed under a theoretical framework which is specifically leftist. I would say that perhaps that's more our framework, our approach to this phenomena. But even in the books, the Sarah Jaffe books that we mentioned, Francesca Cohen books that we mentioned, that those processes, I think, there are happening at a more, let's call it spiritual, let's call it personal level than a, let's say, political informed level, because when I'm just quoting again this Francesca Cohen's book, because it's the one I read more recently, she kind of framed the process of breaking up with works as a broken marriage, so a relationship that don't work anymore, and it's not specifically seen under a political lens. So I don't know if your question comes from a place of slight discomfort related to your political positioning in these processes, but I would say that there is space for your sensibility, for your perspective in the analysis of these phenomena, even if you don't feel that you are necessarily up to necessarily aligned with let's say more or less orthodox leftist position, because I think that in reading the process of quitting sabotage, you don't need to kind of pledge faith to a certain type of political direction. If you have the sensitivity, if you have the eyes to see those phenomena and they interested you, there is space for you to interpret, understand that, even without necessarily adhering to a certain theoretical framework. I don't know if it has to do with your question, but this is what kind of I don't know, hit me from your question. So yeah, this would be like my kind of my answer. I know it's not completely an answer, but this is what I can intellectually produce this afternoon in June.
So I think that I guess so. I guess I have a few things I want to say. One is so I suppose there's a point here, which is I guess like the political point, which is that, you know, I think particularly because Marxists, and I am a Marxist, sorry, to everyone, sorry to my parents, etc. Like, I am a Marxist. I haven't grown out of that. I'm 35 years old, nor will I. In fact, I'll probably harden as I get older. I don't know. Who knows? But I'm also a big fan of Socrates, and so I think in the spirit of our kind of like sort of Socratic Elancius here, like I feel like my politics, for example, got better, more interesting, more receptive, and more engaged with other people's ideas when I began to admit, and for me it took quite a long time. You're 19, I think I took to about 28 to admit that I didn't sort of basically know about everything. And for many people, they never learn that skill. But I think fundamentally that is kind of, where wisdom lies. And I think it's also important to say that the language deployed by Marxism, because it is a conflict theory, often sounds like struggle that must be won at all costs. It seems like a sort of set of theories that kind of have sort of strife kind of at their heart and a sort of bellicose or whatever, and sometimes the language can seem that way. However, what these ideas are about, for me certainly, is about making life better for everybody. And this is why the sort of horseshoe theory of politics is bullshit, because I do think that fundamentally the ideas of the Italian autonomists, for example, are about making life sort of better for everyone. Now, I don't believe that it's purely the case that only the people on kind of like radical heterodox Marxism who call themselves autonomists are the only people who want to make life better for everyone. Far from it. There are a lot of people, across the political spectrum, maybe not at that very far end, but there are quite a lot of people across the political spectrum who fundamentally want to make life sort of better for everyone. So I certainly wouldn't sort of dismiss, the ideas of anyone who, was thinking in sort of very sort of different like set of categories. One of my closest interlocutors about precisely these issues is my most elderly friend, who is a Catholic priest who was imprisoned under the KGB. He's a very interesting man. We'll talk about it another time, another stream.
Let's invite him.
We should invite him, yeah. But in terms of the ideas you're talking about there, and this kind of, the role of kind of epistemologies like within this, I want to point you to. There's a really great book, and this actually brings us back to what we're talking about in terms of our very first engagement with these ideas. So when I was involved with student occupations, we were engaging with the ideas of autonomia, but we were also devouring the online lectures of the geographer David Harvey, talking about Capital Volume 1, and he goes through it chapter by chapter, and you sort of read it with him, and he riffs off of it. And he turned this into a book, I think it's just called Reading Marx's Capital, and he's done 3 volumes. I'd sort of, suggest the first one, really. And throughout this book, like, it's not that David Harvey is interested at all in like telling you like what to think, and certainly as a geographer, he has a really sort of interesting perspective on a lot of these ideas, but he's just kind of like riffing on them and kind of improvising around it, and it's this kind of like almost like a sort of like a jazz interpretation of what Marx is sort of talking about, that goes in lots of different dimensions and brings in questions of temporality or spatiality and so on. But he gets to this bit where he draws our attention to and this sounds like the most like wanky Marxist conference thing to say, but it is worthwhile in the book. He draws us to this footnote in one of the chapters of Marx's Capital Volume 1. And he makes an awful lot, he dedicates basically a whole chapter to this sort of one footnote and explains why he thinks it's important. Now, what he says is he's basically talking about the various factors that kind of work together to sort of dynamically generate momentum within society, to both provide avenues, that might close down and open up, new sort of paths forward. And what David Harvey talks about within this is that he cites 6 things that Marx kind of lists very quickly, and then he adds a sort of 7th of his own. I've tried to write down the 7 things on my notepad here, and I've managed 5 of them, so you'll have to go and look up the book, and everyone at home will as well. But some of those factors in this kind of dynamic that's working together are our relationship to technology, relationship to nature, the forces of production, the conditions of social reproduction, and one of them that always sticks in my mind is mental conceptions of the world. And David Harvey says that these work together in a kind of dynamic assemblage, which is different to a kind of like Hegelian Marxist dialectic that's like a purely kind of like either idealistic in the sort of capital I German idealism sort of sense of the word, or a sort of like rigidly materialistic. And of course, Tronci is guilty of this too. I mean, he reverses the dialectic, but it's still fundamentally a very sort of like heavily structural dialectic for him and his sort of thinking. And I think that what David Harvey does here is introduces a kind of sensitivity to to different conceptions of the world and different sort of forms of life that is both inclusive of a sort of a broader range of ideas than we might find within sort of traditional sort of Marxist thought, but also actually more politically interesting and productive for it. All right.
I think
we're at time.
It's time to wrap up.
It's time. We're going to get back on the Prosecco. We've both run dry.
Thank you for those who were online and to those who were in the room with us, chatting and listening. See you, I suppose, in the autumn.
I guess it's the end of this is
it's
the end of season 1.
This is the end of season 1. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Keith.
Please come on this side of the green screen. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. And see you soon. Bye. Have a great summer of quitting and refusal.
Ciao.